All right. Speaking of China and deals, why don't we talk about China's southern neighbor, India? And a certain world leader, Narendra Modi, ended up in Washington. And let's discuss Narendra Modi's consequential Washington trip. So, Glenn, you've been on Indian television non-stop. What do you think for all of this?
Well, it's the Wild West Indian television, I find.
Or the Wild East.
Or
the Wild East.
Or the Wild East, okay. It ranges from the sobriety and perceptive, subtle nuances of NDTV to the craziness of other networks that I suppose I shouldn't name, where they're just shouting matches. But I suppose that's the sign of a healthy information space. So Modi's trip to the U.S., it was a state visit. It's only the third that Biden's had. A state visit is a big sign of the importance that the host country would like to attribute to the visit by the country in question. But is it more than a sign? And I think was the state visit of Modi to Washington more than just a symbolic step and an expression of hope? And I think the answer is yes, it was. Historic implies, I think, to me, that the hinge of history has changed, has opened, turned. Kissinger goes to Beijing. Oh my goodness, and the world changes, or World War II ends, or something like this. And it's not that consequential. It's not historic in that sense, but it is consequential. To me, it is the visit was putting a seal, I suppose, an open stamp of affirmation by both Washington and Delhi on the changing and increasingly substantially changing nature of the relations between the United States and India. And most of this really is occurring in India, in the Indian government, rather than the U.S. The U.S. has been a suitor, in my view, of India for more than 2 decades, wanting India to embrace the normative Western system and strategically be an ally of the United States. And India has always kept that at arm's length. That's less the case.
Let's very quickly give our listeners and viewers an idea why that is so. Back in the 1950s, India, or almost immediately after 1947, India adopted the socialist path. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was an ardent Fabian socialist who came out of Cambridge, just as the spies of the KGB came out of Cambridge. Cambridge was very left-leaning then, and he was deeply influenced by the Soviet Union during his trip there. In fact, he brought the 5-year planning to India. The Planning Commission imposed some sort of vegetarian Stalinism on India. They didn't kill as many people, but they certainly tied up India in red tape. And the Hindu rate of growth was actually a consequence of socialism. It was the Soviet-inspired rate of growth. And this socialism was imposed by a colonial bureaucracy. Now, under Narendra Modi, India has a center-right government. Some would say, no, it's more to the right, but really it is quite center-right, and it still follows many socialistic policies. The bureaucracy is still quite powerful. Having said that, there is a renewed focus on India's role in the world, and India does want strategic autonomy. But India is much more pro-US, partly because Narendra Modi is a Gujarati. The Gujaratis have done extraordinarily well in the US. They are an entrepreneurial lot. And he has had a rapturous welcome in the expatriate community in the US. And he has a more favorable view of the US than his predecessors. So he's bet big on the relationship with the US, even though he was denied a visa for a while by the earlier administrations. But once, of course, he won the prime ministership, he was welcomed by Barack Obama. He certainly got a bit too close to Donald Trump, but that doesn't seem to have hurt his chances with Joe Biden. Ultimately, as as I see it, and I'm sure Glenn might agree to some degree, it's all about interests, interests, and interests. And the interests of the US and India align. Nation states or any two states are determined by interests. And at this moment, the stars are favorably aligned.
Absolutely. I'm going to take 15 seconds and close the door, which is swung open. I'll be right back.
All right. In the meantime, in those 15 seconds,
come in, but I don't want to
in those 15 seconds, I will just give you a summary of what is driving the US. I said I'll just give a quick summary of what is driving the US rapprochement or US wooing of India. Well, one is China. The US does want a counterbalance to China in Asia, and it wants a free Indo-Pacific. And India can offer the US strategic heft. That is why the US has offered India General Electric advanced fighter jet engines and agreed to a greater transfer of US jet engine technology than ever before. So the US has relented on technology transfer, a big ask by the Indians, and something that the Soviets delivered earlier. Indians, on their part, have bought MQ-9B Predator drones from General Atomics, a fantastic company headed by an Indian-American CEO, Vivek Lal. And these drones will be assembled in India. So Russia, which is currently the biggest military supplier, 45%, might soon lose ground to the US if this trend continues, and it is likely to continue. Also, India will be a semiconductor base. This de-risks some of the supply chain in the long term. And more importantly, both countries have settled 6 separate trade disputes at the which they had at the World Trade Organization, including one that involved tariffs. And trade is a glue that joins two potential partners, two allies, and any two states. And so all these things are moving the US and India in one direction. So China, the big Indian market, which is attractive to American companies, India as a destination for American investment, the close people-to-people ties, so many Indian Americans in the US, and of course, all said and done, the familiarity of dealing with another rambunctious democracy with shouty television channels, all of that help both the countries come closer. Glenn, over to you.
I think we can summarize maybe why India and the U.S. are so clearly moving closer together strategically with 2 words: power and threat. I will take even a stronger view than you just expressed about why India, from independence until recent years, was so ardently avoided aligning with the West, with the United States. But of course, the U.S. was the successor to the Raj. That was the fear. And India had had enough of having another state de facto guide its policies. And so I completely understand the top priority of maintaining independence. And why should a newly independent state that could avoid taking a side immerse itself in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the U.S.? I completely understand that. But power and threats have changed. The relative power of the United States is less because other countries now have much more. They have developed economically, politically, and militarily. In particular, the 2 key ones, which is China and India. China is exponentially, literally orders of magnitude more powerful than it was 20 years ago. And India has a 2,000-kilometer or 3,000-kilometer border and has had wars in our lifetimes with China. At the same time, India is no longer happily a purely socialist economy that struggles even to feed itself. It has embraced now for 2 decades, 2 decades.
Actually, four decades, since 1991. Okay. The year Soviet Union collapsed, that is the year India liberalized its markets. And speaking of suspicion of the US, I think two events really embedded suspicion of the US in Indian minds. One was the 1953 CIA-led coup in Iran, which basically, for a newly independent India, was the US taking the side of the Brits, conducting a coup for egregious British demands on a de facto colony, or a formerly de facto colony asserting independence. And then, of course, was 1971, the US support for Pakistan, when Pakistan was conducting ethnic cleansing, mass rape, and frankly, genocide in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. So these things embedded suspicions in Indian minds. And lest we forget, Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter, Indira Gandhi, was particularly seduced by Soviet ideas.
Figuratively and literally.
Yes. So old members of the CIA say that in 1953, Glenn, you can complete this story.
Yeah, well, the heart has reasons that reason cannot know. This is Pascal, and so the emotional identification with Moscow from Indian elites is developed over generations of cow eyes, and I'm not being facetious, and support from Moscow. But so, India is no longer
so that era has
needs
passed.
To come hand in hand anywhere. India, in the last decade in particular, even in the last 5 years, has become truly, for the first time, a global power, and is more so relative to everyone else every day. For every country has huge problems, but India is a huge country and a huge power, and growing so. And it also has a growing strategic challenge with the great human success story of Chinese economic development of the last 40 years on Indian borders. So it is natural for India to look for a counterbalancing ally, as it has been for the United States, and for them to look at each other as China grows. And as India no longer needs to, it has the confidence, frankly, of a healthy and dynamic state, rather than the insecurities of a recently colonized, newly independent and weak state. That was the case from 1947 until 2010. And so Modi, it's not just Modi. Modi, I think, embodies the sense of power, agency, and confidence of a dynamic society. I mean, you can give him some credit or some of the blame. He deserved both. But I think that explains why this is a consequential trip, because there are concrete steps being taken, but it is not a historic shift. It is a continuation of an historic shift that has been growing over now 2 decades, really, since President Bush.
Yeah, I would say that this is like a marriage ceremony. There was a long period of preparation that went before it, and it's a first step towards a closer partnership going forward. It is not an earth-changing Kissinger-style trip to China. It's just a formalizing of a relationship that is becoming closer and is likely to become even closer going forward. And
but it is far more than simply symbolic, however, as you touched upon. I think 1/3. I'll get the gist correct. The precise data we can get, but this is essentially correct. 1/3 of substantial elements of the U.S. Air Force production occurs jointly in India, physically in India, for all of the transport aircraft. Fuselages are made in India. There are exponentially increasing agreements on semiconductor and software development projects jointly between the United States and India, and all of the some of the catchphrases of the moment are what are they? Reshoring and friendshoring, and they aren't just
And
jokes.
nearshoring.
Nearshoring, as the tensions between the U.S. and China have become acute. India has dynamic sectors of the economy, cutting-edge sectors, increasingly so, on critical sectors of economic development and strategic economic products. And it certainly makes sense to put them with even a difficult friend than with a severe rival. So these are historic changes that are occurring, yeah. So it's a dramatically new world for anything we've lived in before.
Yeah, and India is one large economy that is going to grow fast, at least in the coming decade.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.